The air inside the chamber was already heavy, a mixture of impatience and quiet outrage. Papers rustled, pens tapped against wooden desks, and the steady hum of whispers filled the space. It was supposed to be a hearing, but in that moment it felt more like a battlefield. At the center stood Ted Cruz, his voice slicing through the room with yet another interruption. It was the 6th time he had done it. Each cut into her words had the same smug rhythm, the same performance designed not to clarify but to dominate. Jasmine Crockett stopped speaking mid-sentence, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. She turned her head, leveled her gaze at him, and for the first time that day, the noise of the chamber seemed to bend towards silence. This wasn't just about parliamentary procedure. This wasn't about rules of decorum or policy disagreements. To everyone watching, it was about something bigger. Who gets to speak and who gets told to sit down? The interruptions carried centuries of echoes, an old tactic wrapped in new arrogance. And with each one, the patience of the room thinned. Crockett didn't rush to answer. She didn't fidget or raise her voice. Instead, she let the stillness do the talking, a pause so sharp it made the interruption itself look small. Cameras zoomed closer. Staffers shifted in their chairs. Somewhere in the back, a muffled cough broke the tension, but no one dared to speak. 6 times. That was the count. 6 separate attempts to derail, to silence, to chip away at the authority of the woman at the microphone. And then came the 7th. Cruz leaned in with the same condescension, expecting her to falter. But instead of shrinking, Crockett straightened, her shoulders steady, her tone measured, her presence undeniable. The narrator's words hovered above the scene, invisible yet unmistakable. 6 times he had tried to silence her. But on the 7th, the chamber witnessed history. It was as though the entire room leaned forward at once, waiting to see what would follow. The clash was no longer procedural. It was personal. It was cultural. It was political theater at its sharpest edge. And in the silence between Cruz's interruption and Crockett's response, the atmosphere became electric, because with just one line everything changed. The hearing was not just another day on Capitol Hill. It was a high-stakes confrontation about justice, accountability, and the very question of who gets to be heard in America's most powerful rooms. The topic itself, though wrapped in legalese and procedure, was explosive. Testimonies carried implications for how power would be checked, how communities would be represented, and whether dignity could stand firm against the weight of entrenched arrogance. For millions watching from afar, it wasn't policy jargon, it was identity. It was proof of whether voices like theirs could rise without being trampled. And into that stage strode Ted Cruz. With his booming interruptions, he wasn't merely challenging Jasmine Crockett's argument. He was challenging her right to deliver it uninterrupted. Each time he cut across her words, the room felt it. The snap of his voice against her steady tone created a rhythm that grew more jarring with every exchange. It was less debate, more domination. Less inquiry, more insult. Observers shifted in their chairs. Some rolled their eyes, others looked down at their notes, as though embarrassed by the spectacle, because anyone who had been in spaces like these knew exactly what was happening. A woman of color dared to assert herself in a chamber where power still carried an old, familiar face. And Cruz, consciously or not, performed the role of gatekeeper, testing her patience, testing her presence, testing whether she would stay standing after 6 attempts to shut her down. For Crockett, this wasn't just about answering policy questions. It was about carrying the weight of every woman who had been told to lower her voice, every immigrant who had been told they didn't belong, every young progressive who wondered whether the system would ever make room for them. Her silence between interruptions, her deliberate refusal to be rattled, became louder than Cruz's words. Each pause was a declaration: you cannot erase me. You will not write over me. And yet, the tension grew. 6 times he had pressed in, leaning on condescension, wielding interruption like a weapon. 6 times Crockett had reset, refusing to take the bait. By now the committee members could feel it. The clash was no longer simply about a hearing. It had become a symbol. On one side the arrogance of the old order, embodied in Cruz's smirk and sharp tone. On the other the calm defiance of a new voice, demanding respect without raising its volume. Every time his voice cut her off, the room seemed to contract, the walls closing tighter around the hearing. Staffers scribbled notes, reporters perked up, cameras lingered longer on Crockett's expression. Even those used to the chaos of Capitol Hill felt it. Something in this moment carried more weight than usual. The audience at home, too, could sense the imbalance. Progressive viewers, young activists, immigrant families, all recognized the theater of interruption. They'd lived it in workplaces, classrooms, community meetings. Watching Cruz barrel over her words felt painfully familiar, like watching the same story replayed on a larger stage. But history rarely announces itself before it arrives. And no one in that chamber could have guessed how quickly the air was about to shift. Not Cruz, who thought another interruption would drown her out. Not the committee, who expected more of the same procedural noise. Not even Crockett herself, who carried her composure like armor, but could not yet see how one line would ignite a movement. Because what came next, on the seventh interruption, would not simply raise the stakes. It would rewrite the narrative. To understand why the chamber held its breath each time Ted Cruz interrupted, you have to know who Ted Cruz is in the political theater of America. He is not merely a senator from Texas. He is a man who has built his brand on sharp elbows and louder-than-life performances, a politician who treats every microphone like a stage, and every committee hearing like a courtroom drama, where his role is part prosecutor, part showman. From the moment he entered the national spotlight, Cruz cultivated a reputation for smug certainty. His voice carries a lawyer's cadence, crisp and cutting, but layered with a tone that often drips with condescension. To supporters, it's confidence. To critics, it's arrogance. Either way, it has become his signature. He leans into interruptions not as mistakes but as strategy, chopping up his opponent's rhythm, inserting himself into their sentences, ensuring that his presence dominates every exchange. This isn't new. Cruz has a history of treating debates less as forums for truth and more as opportunities for performance. From the Republican presidential primary stage in 2016, where his sharp tongue won headlines but alienated colleagues, to Senate hearings where his questions often meander into grandstanding speeches, Cruz has made a career out of volume over vision. He relishes confrontation not for resolution but for spectacle, convinced that rhetorical fireworks are enough to substitute for substance. But spectacle has a cost. Ask his colleagues in the Senate. Many will admit, off the record, that Cruz is among the least liked members of their chamber. They tire of his constant need to be the loudest voice in the room, his performative outrage, his endless quest for viral clips rather than policy progress. Time and again, he's been described as someone who mistakes obstruction for principle, disruption for courage. His controversies are well documented. Who can forget his fiery tirades against bills he knew had enough votes to pass regardless of his objections, or his performative reading of Green Eggs and Ham during a marathon speech meant less to change minds and more to generate headlines. These episodes were not about governance, they were about Cruz playing Cruz, casting himself as the defender of an America under siege, even if that siege existed mostly in his own theatrics. And then there was the moment that defined his contradictions for millions, the infamous Cancun trip. As his state froze under a deadly storm, Cruz boarded a plane to warmth, abandoning his constituents in their darkest hour. It was the perfect snapshot of his politics. Loud and combative when safe inside a committee room, absent and evasive when real stakes demanded action. The outrage that followed didn't silence him, but it did burn away whatever illusion remained of his seriousness. For many, he became not a leader, but a caricature, a man who loves the fight more than the responsibility. Inside the hearing room with Jasmine Crockett, all of these traits converged. The smug smile as he leaned in to interrupt. The self-satisfaction in his tone as though each interjection were a clever thrust in a debate no one else was playing. His interruptions weren't just about that day's testimony. They were about his entire approach to power. Cruz has long mistaken noise for strength, interruptions for victories, and dominance for respect. But in truth, each one revealed his insecurity, his inability to let another voice command attention. Cruz's brand of arrogance thrives in environments where people shrink back, where opponents falter under pressure, where volume overwhelms patience. It works as long as the other side plays by the rules of restraint while he shreds them. Yet arrogance, when repeated too often, becomes predictable. Predictability makes it weak. And weakness, when exposed in the bright lights of a hearing room, can collapse faster than anyone expects. The interruptions that day weren't simply Cruz being rude. They were Cruz being Cruz, acting from habit, from muscle memory, from the belief that if he spoke often enough, and loud enough, he could control the story. He believed, as he always had, that words spoken over someone else were words won. But arrogance has a breaking point, and Cruz was about to find his. Long before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in a congressional hearing room, she had been preparing for moments like this. Born and raised in Dallas, Texas, Crockett grew up in a community that knew both the weight of injustice and the power of resilience. Her story wasn't gilded with privilege, it was shaped by grit, family, and a determination to stand tall in spaces that were never designed for her to enter. From a young age, she carried a fierce awareness of inequality. She saw how opportunity often passed over entire neighborhoods, how young people with dreams as bright as hers were told to keep them small, And she decided early on that her life would not be about shrinking. It would be about fighting for those who had been told to be quiet, to step aside, to accept less. That fight led her to law school, a world still dominated by men who spoke loudly and often, assuming their voices carried more weight than anyone else's. Crockett learned quickly how to navigate that terrain. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She didn't need to storm into rooms demanding respect. She carried herself with quiet composure, letting her preparation, her clarity, and her truth do the work. Colleagues noticed. Judges noticed. Even opponents noticed. She was the one who never rattled. The one who answered interruptions with precision instead of anger. Her legal career became her training ground for political battle. As a public defender, she stood for clients who had no one else, people who were overlooked or written off. She confronted prosecutors with sharp questions and cross-examinations that cut through bluster to reveal the truth. Time and again, she saw how power tried to bulldoze the powerless, and time and again, she stepped between them. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was righteous work. And it built in her a philosophy that would become her signature. Let them talk loud. I'll answer with truth. When she moved into politics, Crockett carried that same energy. She was not the kind of leader who basked in ceremony or tradition. She came into the chamber to represent, to disrupt, to give voice to communities that had long been left out of the conversation. That alone made her a target for those who thrived on the old ways. She entered a male-dominated, ego-driven world, and instead of softening her edge, she sharpened it. It was not easy. She faced the coded criticisms women in politics know all too well: too bold, too loud, too ambitious. Her presence unsettled those who believed politics was a space for men to spar with one another while women were expected to sit politely on the sidelines. Yet Crockett refused to bend. She knew that every time she sat in silence while arrogance spoke, another young woman somewhere might believe that silence was the price of entry. And she was determined to shatter that illusion. Her composure became her shield. Where others would have erupted at constant interruptions, Crockett learned the power of pausing, of letting arrogance echo in the air long enough to sound foolish on its own. She learned that patience wasn't weakness, it was strategy. It was how you turned someone else's noise into their undoing. Every obstacle prepared her for this. Every courtroom where she stood against stacked odds, every campaign trail where she was underestimated, every whisper that she wasn't polished enough, traditional enough, or safe enough. Each moment of doubt became another layer of armor. By the time she arrived in Congress, she was more than ready. And yet, nothing could fully prepare her for Ted Cruz. His interruptions weren't surprising. Men like him had tried to talk over her for years. But the sheer audacity of doing it 6 times in one hearing carried a weight of history. It wasn't just Cruz interrupting Crockett. It was the old order trying once again to cut off the future. It was arrogance against resilience, bluster against truth. Crockett didn't shrink. She didn't fumble her words or let her composure crack. She let him talk, let him show his hand, let him display the very arrogance that had defined his career. And then she waited, because Jasmine Crockett understood something Ted Cruz never had. The most powerful moment isn't when you interrupt. It's when you refuse to be interrupted. It's when you let silence build into anticipation, when you hold the chamber in the palm of your hand, simply by not flinching. Her entire life had been preparing her for that silence, for the pause. For the moment when arrogance would cross the line one time too many and the stage would belong to her. Every obstacle she faced prepared her for this exact stage. Every trial, every dismissal, every underestimation carved her into the woman who could stand in that chamber without losing an inch of herself. And destiny arrived on interruption number 7. The rhythm of the exchange was becoming unbearable, not only for Jasmine Crockett, but for everyone who sat in that chamber. Each time she began to deliver her point, Ted Cruz cut in with the same pattern: a sharp, cutting interjection meant to derail her argument before it could fully land. The interruptions came like waves, relentless and rehearsed. On the first few, Crockett simply paused, waited, and returned to her point. Her restraint was remarkable, almost unnerving in its steadiness. She refused to raise her voice, refused to meet arrogance with chaos. Instead, she let his noise pass like a gust of hot air, then continued her remarks with clarity. But as the interruptions multiplied, the temperature in the room shifted. By the 4th time, murmurs began spreading across the chamber. Lawmakers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Staffers exchanged glances that said what they could not speak aloud. This is becoming a spectacle. Cruz, however, seemed to thrive on it. He leaned back in his chair with a practiced smirk, chin lifted slightly, as though each interruption were a point scored. His tone grew sharper, his voice more performative, his gaze locked not so much on Crockett as on the cameras capturing his every word. Meanwhile, Crockett's composure never cracked. She sat upright, shoulders squared, hands folded neatly before her. Where Cruz projected swagger, she projected steadiness. Where he sought to dominate, she simply endured. The contrast became more glaring with every exchange. By the fifth interruption, frustration was no longer contained. Audible sighs escaped from the audience. A few heads shook in disbelief. The very air seemed to bristle with impatience. Still, Crockett did not give him what he wanted. No raised voice. No exasperated outburst. Only the same unyielding calm, as if she were saying with her silence, "I've dealt with louder men than you." The sixth interruption landed with an almost scripted rhythm. Cruz leaned forward, finger tapping on the desk, as if to emphasize his dominance. He wore the expression of a man certain he was winning, certain that persistence would eventually force his opponent off balance. And perhaps in most cases it might have. But not here, not with her. Crockett turned her head slowly, fixing him with a measured look that silenced even the faint whispers in the room. It wasn't anger in her eyes. It was something sharper, something steadier. It was the look of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life and had learned to turn that underestimation into power. By now the room was taut with anticipation. The tension had grown so thick that every pause felt like a drumbeat. 6 times Cruz had tried. 6 times Crockett had absorbed it. Everyone present could feel that the balance of this confrontation was teetering on the edge of something larger. Cruz, however, either didn't sense it or refused to. He leaned in once again, voice booming, attempting his 7th interruption, as if the mere repetition of force would guarantee control. But this time, Crockett didn't just pause. She didn't just let him pass. Instead, she leaned forward, closing the physical space between them with deliberate precision. Her posture changed, not aggressive, not defensive, but resolute, almost regal. The murmurs in the chamber ceased. Even the tapping pens and shuffling papers went silent. It was in that lean, in that subtle shift, that the room felt history approaching. She was no longer simply defending her right to speak. She was about to seize control of the entire narrative. Every obstacle she had faced, every interruption she had endured, every ounce of composure she had carried to this moment coalesced into that single movement. And then, on the 7th attempt, Crockett leaned forward, and history leaned with her. The 7th interruption came like all the others, loud, dismissive, dripping with Cruz's trademark smugness. But unlike the 6 before, this one did not pass unnoticed. This time, Jasmine Crockett did not simply absorb it. She leaned forward, her body language sharpening like a blade being unsheathed. For a moment, she let the air stretch thin. Cruz's words still hung in the chamber, yet she did not respond immediately. Instead, she allowed silence to take over, an excruciating pause that seemed to stretch longer with each heartbeat. That silence was not emptiness. It was power. The entire room felt it. The chatter ceased, the scribbling of pens halted. Eyes darted between Cruz's cocky smirk and Crockett's poised stillness. And then she spoke. Her voice did not rise in volume. It did not need to. It carried a weight sharper than any shout could ever manage. She acknowledged his persistence, his arrogance, the way he had made a spectacle of interrupting her 6 times in a row. But then she turned his persistence into his undoing. She framed his behavior not as strength, but as desperation, exposing the truth behind his noise, that a man who interrupts that often is a man afraid of what will be said if the words are allowed to land. The chamber froze. Crockett had not only reclaimed her time, she had flipped the script. In a single line, she transformed Cruz's interruptions from tools of power into proof of weakness. It was surgical, precise, devastating. Cruz tried to recover with a scoff, a tight laugh meant to suggest he wasn't rattled. But the laugh betrayed him. It was too quick, too thin. His eyes shifted briefly, searching the faces around him for reinforcement, for some flicker of agreement. None came. Instead, colleagues leaned back in their chairs with faint smirks, as if silently savoring the reversal. Staffers bit their lips to suppress their reactions. From the back of the room came an audible gasp, followed by the unmistakable murmur of witnesses who knew they had just seen something extraordinary. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smirk or bask in her words. She simply sat there, composed, letting the weight of her statement linger in the air. She understood something Cruz never had. The real mic drop is not in the delivery. It's in the aftermath, in the silence that follows, when everyone in the room realizes the balance of power has shifted. The narrator's voice seemed to hover over the stunned chamber. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a dismantling. Cruz, visibly unsettled now, leaned forward as if to reassert control, but his movements betrayed agitation. The forced rhythm of his voice cracked at the edges. What once seemed like dominance now looked like defensiveness. Every word he tried to force out only underscored the contrast. He was loud, she was steady. He was scrambling, she was unshaken. This was no longer a duel of words, it had become a revelation. The room wasn't just witnessing Crockett defend herself. They were witnessing Cruz unravel. The tension gave way to ripple effects across the chamber. Some colleagues exchanged knowing glances, their eyes sparkling with a mix of admiration for Crockett and disbelief at Cruz's collapse. Others tried to maintain their composure, lips pressed together to keep from betraying their reactions. But the energy was undeniable. Crockett had flipped the power dynamic in real time, and everyone present felt it. The cameras captured it all. The flash of Cruz's fading smirk, the calm steadiness of Crockett's gaze, the collective shift in the room as dignity triumphed over arrogance. It was political theater at its sharpest edge, and Crockett had mastered the stage. Her seventh line takedown wasn't about cleverness for its own sake. It was about clarity. It crystallized everything the audience at home already suspected about Cruz, and everything they admired about Crockett. It spoke to every progressive viewer who had ever been interrupted in a meeting, every woman who had been told to quiet down, every immigrant family who had seen arrogance try to drown out truth. Crockett's composure told them all, "You cannot silence me. You cannot erase me. My voice belongs here as much as yours." For Cruz, the unraveling continued. He shifted in his chair, jaw tightening, eyes narrowing. The laughter he had forced earlier gave way to something closer to irritation. His usual confidence looked frayed, his performance exposed. The very strategy he had leaned on, relentless interruption, had backfired spectacularly. Instead of silencing Crockett, it had amplified her. Instead of diminishing her, it had diminished him. The chamber, once restless and noisy, was now bound by her words. She sat in control, calm, unhurried, as if she had known all along that patience would win. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to match his volume. Her strength came from restraint, from letting him show the world who he was, and then cutting through it with one line that revealed everything. The moment didn't just belong to Crockett. It belonged to history. This was the kind of exchange that would ripple far beyond the walls of that hearing room. Clips would be replayed, shared, analyzed. Commentators would marvel at the composure, the precision, the shift. Memes would spread, headlines would blare, and in each retelling, the seventh interruption would be remembered not as Cruz's triumph, but as his undoing. Crockett, for her part, remained steady. She didn't need to add anything more. The line had been delivered. The silence had done the rest. All that was left was the picture now imprinted in the minds of everyone watching: Ted Cruz, diminished, fumbling to recover; Jasmine Crockett, poised, commanding, untouchable. In that chamber, for that moment, dignity had the last word. And as the silence lingered, the narrator's voice carried the truth the entire nation was beginning to see. This wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a dismantling. The camera seemed to frame a power shot. Crockett seated tall, unbothered, her gaze forward, while Cruz shifted uncomfortably beside her. The symbolism was undeniable. One had been exposed, the other elevated. The hearing was not over. But the story from that moment on would never again be told the same way. The hearing had barely adjourned when the moment began to ripple outward. Clips of Crockett's seventh line takedown hit social media within minutes. On Twitter, hashtags like a Crockett clapback and face seventh interruption surged to the top of the trending list. Millions watched, replayed, and shared the 30-second exchange, each user adding their own caption, their own version of the story. Supporters flooded her mentions with praise. Finally, someone shut him down. This is how you handle arrogance, with truth and composure. For many, Crockett wasn't just a representative from Texas anymore. She was a symbol, a voice that carried their own frustrations, their own silenced moments, into the halls of Congress. The memes were relentless. Side-by-side screenshots contrasted Cruz's smirk before the line with his stunned expression after. TikTok creators layered the clip over dramatic music, freeze, framing on the moment of impact. On Instagram, graphic designers turned Crockett into a comic book hero, her words displayed in bold speech bubbles while Cruz shrank into caricature. Even LinkedIn posts, normally a space for polite professionalism, buzzed with think pieces on composure, leadership, and the power of patience in the face of provocation. Late-night comedians wasted no time. Monologues on Fallon, Colbert, and Myers all featured segments mocking Cruz's unraveling. One compared his smirk to silence arc to a Wi-Fi signal dropping mid-Zoom call. Another quipped, "Ted Cruz interrupted 6 times and lost 7 arguments." The audiences roared, not just at the punchlines, but at the recognition that they had all witnessed the same undeniable reversal. But the moment was more than a laugh line. Political commentators quickly framed it as a metaphor for broader currents in American politics. On MSNBC, one analyst noted, Crockett didn't just win a point, she exposed a pattern. Men like Cruz trying to dominate the space, only to crumble when challenged with clarity and calm. The Washington Post ran a headline declaring, "The day Cruz met his match." Vox highlighted it as a turning point in how women of color in Congress are rewriting the rules of debate. Across the country, grassroots groups seized on the clip to inspire volunteers and fundraisers. Emails went out with subject lines like, "Did you see Jasmine Crockett last night?" The clip became a rallying cry, proof that dignity could puncture arrogance, that representation mattered not in theory but in practice, on the record, in real time. Cruz, meanwhile, found himself at the center of a storm he could not control. His usual supporters tried to spin the moment as unfair editing, or as liberal bias. But the raw footage was undeniable. Every pause, every smirk, every failed attempt to recover. It was all there, captured live. He became a punchline on TikTok, his name trending not for legislative achievement, but for humiliation. Even his colleagues couldn't shield him. Quiet whispers in the halls of Congress suggested that Cruz had overplayed his hand, that his interruptions had backfired. Some rolled their eyes, privately admitting that Crockett's line would haunt him for years to come. The man who had built a career on debate tactics had, for once, been debated into silence. Meanwhile, Crockett's team found themselves overwhelmed. Phones rang with requests for interviews. Messages poured in from supporters across the political spectrum: immigrants, young activists, even disillusioned moderates who said they felt seen. For the first time in years. For them, her composure was not just admirable, it was vindicating. She hadn't just spoken for herself, she had spoken for all of them. And yet, beneath the frenzy of hashtags and laughter, something deeper stirred. The moment was more than viral entertainment. It struck a nerve because it illuminated a truth about power, arrogance, and the resilience of those long underestimated. The memes, the monologues, the headlines. They were all surface waves, but underneath, the current was moving in a profound direction. Crockett's seventh line wasn't simply a takedown of Ted Cruz. It was a lesson echoing far beyond that chamber, a lesson the nation needed to hear. And as the laughter subsided, the narrator's voice sharpened the suspense. But beyond the memes, there was a deeper lesson to be heard. The frenzy of memes and headlines was loud, but beneath the noise lay the real heart of the moment. Crockett's seventh line was not just a clever rebuttal. It was a crystallization of a truth older and stronger than the chamber in which it was spoken. For years, arrogance had strutted in the halls of power, cloaked in titles and puffed up confidence. Men like Ted Cruz had treated interruptions as weapons, mistaking volume for victory, mistaking swagger for substance. But Crockett revealed something undeniable: arrogance is brittle. It can shout, but it cannot endure. Her words reframed the confrontation entirely. She did not simply shut Cruz down. She illuminated the difference between noise and truth. His interruptions were noise, loud, repetitive, empty. Her response was truth, measured, steady, impossible to shake. And when truth meets noise, the outcome is inevitable. In that hearing room, dignity proved itself stronger than arrogance. Crockett's composure, her refusal to be dragged into the chaos, became a lesson not just for her colleagues, but for the millions watching at home. She showed that true strength is not about overpowering others, but about standing firm when others try to topple you. She showed that service, rooted in justice, in representation, in the hard fight for fairness, will always rise above ego. This is why her words resonated far beyond the chamber. For every woman who had been talked over in a meeting, for every young immigrant told to wait their turn, for every voice dismissed before it was even heard, Crockett embodied their struggle and their triumph. She became not only a congresswoman defending her place, but a symbol of resilience, justice, and belonging. Her seventh line was not just for that day, not just for that room. It was a reminder to America itself: interruptions cannot silence dignity. Arrogance cannot erase truth. Ego cannot outlast service. The narrator's voice swelled like a crescendo, carrying the moral clarity forward. This wasn't about one clash in one hearing. It was about the kind of nation we choose to be. Do we reward arrogance, or do we honor dignity? Do we amplify noise, or do we listen for truth? Do we follow ego, or do we serve justice? The answers weren't found in Cruz's smirk or his seventh interruption. They were found in Crockett's steadiness, in her quiet strength, in the way her line pierced through the chamber and echoed into the public square. She showed America a different kind of leadership, not performative, not blustering, but grounded, courageous, resilient. And so the moral of that day was bigger than politics. It was about identity, about validation, about a universal truth that stretched beyond party lines. Every viewer who felt invisible, every listener who felt talked over, could see themselves in Crockett. She wasn't just standing up to Ted Cruz, she was standing up for them. In that way, the hearing transformed into something larger than debate. It became a parable. A reminder that history doesn't bend toward the loudest voice, it bends toward the truest one. As the section closed, the final words landed with a tone both triumphant and solemn. This was never just about one hearing. It was about reminding America. Interruptions cannot silence dignity. And with that, the story edged toward its conclusion, leaving one final question lingering: how would this moment be remembered, not just online, but in the hearts of those who witnessed it? On his seventh interruption, Ted Cruz broke. But Jasmine Crockett did not. She stood steady, unshaken, a living reminder that arrogance will always collapse under the weight of truth. What began as just another heated exchange in Congress became something much larger, a symbol of how dignity triumphs when it refuses to bow. This wasn't just political theater. It was a lesson about power, identity, and the resilience of voices too often dismissed. Crockett proved that no matter how many times arrogance tries to silence truth, truth will rise. And when it does, the noise fades, the ego crumbles, the performance is exposed. That is why her seventh-line takedown will live far beyond that hearing room. It belongs to anyone who has been interrupted one too many times. Anyone who has been told their words don't matter. Anyone who has felt the sting of dismissal. Her moment was more than a clapback. It was a declaration: you cannot erase me. If you believe in that message, if you believe that dignity is stronger than arrogance, then this is your movement too. Subscribe. Join the movement where dignity always triumphs over arrogance. Share. Send this to someone who's been interrupted one too many times, and remind them their voice has power. Comment. Tell us, what does standing for truth mean to you? This story is not finished. It continues every time arrogance meets dignity, every time noise confronts truth, every time someone stands tall against interruption. Crockett gave us the example. Now it's up to us to carry it forward. Because in the end, history doesn't remember the smirk. It remembers the moment the truth broke through.